Good evening. Welcome to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. I'm Buffy. I'm an 18-year criminal defense attorney who will be providing legal analysis on this case that we're doing today, as well as providing compassion for the people who've lost their lives in this case as well, because they were real people who were loved by others and were taken away much too soon. The case we're doing today is the OJ Simpson case, racism, reasonable doubt, and the evidence people avoid. To talk honestly about the OJ Simpson case, we have to do something uncomfortable. We have to hold two things at the same time: that racism and police misconduct occurred. It mattered, and it mattered deeply, and that the evidence strongly suggests OJ Simpson committed the murders. This case wasn't a victory or a failure. It was a collision between truth, proof, race, and a system that lost control of itself. Let's talk about the victims, recentering the case. Before analysis, we recenter the people that were harmed. Nicole Brown Simpson, documented history of domestic violence, multiple 911 calls, escalating fear, a system that repeatedly returned her to danger. And what was the common denominator as to why she was continually put back in danger? The common denominator was the fact that sometimes money talks louder than anything else. And the fact that you have a very famous, very seemingly charismatic man who is very charismatic. He appears to be funny. He appears to be jovial. He appears to have a good personality. For those who don't know what's going on behind the scenes with the domestic violence. And ultimately, domestic batterers all have the ability to hide their true self to those who they don't want to know who they actually are, right? So people are like, OJ Simpson, like there's no way he's the way that she says he is. And but for Nicole Brown Simpson continuing to call 911, and at one point, you can actually hear her husband on the other end of the line berating her and screaming at her, in her absolute fear when she's calling 911, saying he's going to kill me. And unfortunately, her words, especially after she had been murdered, were definitely prophetic and profound and very unfortunate. Ronald Goldman, often erased from the narrative. He had no relationship to the conflict whatsoever. I think ultimately there was a story where people were trying to allege that maybe they had a relationship of some kind. That was never proven. You also know that essentially he was a waiter at the restaurant that she had gone to that night, and he was returning her sunglasses. So he is the ultimate wrong place, wrong time scenario, unfortunately, and it cost him his life. And he was killed simply because he was the third wheel to something that had already been decided to be set into motion. And that is extremely tragic for both parties. Not to mention the people that they left behind, and Nicole and her children, what she left behind there. Very sad. Let's talk about the racial context. This cannot be ignored. The OJ trial did not happen in a vacuum. LAPD had a documented history of racial violence, falsified evidence, and brutality. This was a powder keg in the 90s. You had Rodney King being beaten just 3 years earlier, the law enforcement officers being acquitted. So racial tensions were high. If you know the history of LA, you know about Watts and things like that were going on in the riots. And officers, even though there was video evidence, were acquitted, which caused a firestorm because the African American population felt that they weren't being seen and that they were going to have to potentially protect themselves from what they saw as a racial injustice. And given the fact that there was video testimony, racial injustice is exactly what it was. And for many jurors, especially African American jurors, the trial was not just about OJ Simpson. It was about whether the LAPD could be trusted at all. That distrust was earned, not imagined, because it had been a systemic problem. Let's talk now about Mark Fuhrman. He was another character that was in this, and why Mark Fuhrman mattered so much. Mark Fuhrman had a history of using racial slurs repeatedly. He had written a screenplay or a play or something of that kind on his experience as LAPD. And he was very, very blunt and very direct about some of the things that he said, including using racial slurs, including having choice terms for women who were in the department. He lied under oath. And ultimately, if I'm analyzing this case, the thing that I think that ultimately could have potentially altered the outcome is if Mark Fuhrman had been honest. If he had said, yes, I have used racial slurs. Yes, I have had issues with racism in the past. However, when he lied, he created an opportunity for the defense, the high-powered attorneys that OJ Simpson could afford. Johnny Cochran, for instance, you probably remember, if it doesn't fit, you must have quit. All sorts of other little jabs and little, 3-second sound bites, because that was the point. They knew they were being televised. They wanted to perform. They had F. Lee Bailey, who I believe eventually ended up being disbarred after many years later. They also had Robert Shapiro. They were called probably the Dream Team. But the thing is, if Mark Fuhrman had been honest initially, he could have taken away some of the sting of that. However, he almost became the main character over the two victims and even over OJ, right? And that took center stage. And so it was pretty obvious when he took the fifth, which is, I'm not going to, I plead the fifth. I'm not going to say or do anything that might incriminate me. Ultimately, he's saying, in a way, without saying, yes, I use these racial epithets. Yes, I have been racist, but he didn't say it directly. And so he had a credibility destroying story. And so what happens with that is when the defense asks, have you ever used racial slurs? And for him to say no, then it becomes a case where they can go back to those tapes and play those tapes and say, is this you? And on such and such date, did you say this racial slur? And then it comes out and it's an impeachable testimony, which means he was not honest. And that small, to some people that may seem like a small thing, but that destroyed his credibility. Absolutely destroyed his credibility. And with it, it also made the racial slur a big part of the case. And it also made it look like Mark Fuhrman had planted evidence. Now, whether or not he planted evidence or he didn't plant evidence, we still don't know to this day. But if there is even a hint that he did something like that, and a lot of people believe that he did, and I'm not going to weigh in either way because I don't know. I can't say definitively, nor would I. But that seed was planted, and there was already a high level of distrust for the LAPD. And even if Fuhrman did not plant evidence, the DNA was real. The DNA was real. Fuhrman's presence poisoned the well. The legal reality is that when a witness lies, Jurors are permitted to distrust every single thing that follows. So even if that glove was not planted, which they tried to say that it was, even if that was the case, a lot of people were like, I don't trust him. He's LAPD. He lied. I saw him lie. I mean, I just don't trust him. And that's their right to do that. And so essentially that had ramifications for the jury. So let's actually talk about the evidence. The evidence and why it still points to OJ. This is the part people avoid because it's uncomfortable. The evidence included OJ's blood at the crime scene, the victim's blood at OJ's residence and in his vehicle. And if you recall, there was an incident where he said that he had cut himself like on a whiskey glass or something along those lines, which is why he was bleeding. There was a matching glove. And let's talk about the matching glove. I believe they were Bruno Mali's. And let's also talk about the Bruno Mali's shoes, okay? First of all, the matching glove was a very expensive type of glove, Italian leather, fitted. What Johnny Cochran did was masterful. It was also somewhat deceitful, I would say. But his whole thing was OJ Simpson, as a football star, had a lot of issues with arthritis and such from all the wear and tear his body had taken over the years from his career. So if OJ Simpson is not taking his arthritis medication, his joints are going to swell. With fitted gloves, you put your swollen hands in a fitted glove, it's not going to fit, especially if you haven't been taking your arthritis medication for who knows how long. And then you're going to stretch your hands out as wide as they will go, and you will say, it doesn't fit. And what was the phrase? If it doesn't fit, you must acquit, right? The other thing, let's talk also about the Bruno Mali shoes. The Bruno Mali shoes, he actually had done work with. He had actually advertised those shoes. It was well known that he had Bruno Mali shoes, and they were a very large size because he had very large feet. He's a big man. And so who's going to have that expensive of shoes, right? The other thing I remember learning when I was in high school, I actually wanted to do this case because I remember in 7th grade when I was waiting for the verdict, being so sad and so overwhelmed for the victims of that crime. And everyone was like cheering. And I was like, oh, he must have been found guilty. No, everyone was cheering because he had been found not guilty. Because they didn't understand DNA at that time. It was one of the first cases that they were kind of dealing with DNA. And everyone was so excited that he had been, because he was a football star and he was an actor and he was, and so everyone was so excited about that. And I remember thinking how big of an injustice that actually was. And I've thought about that a lot. I remember that summer just watching that trial with my grandma, and it was just really sad and really hard to think about too. Also, like we talked about, the cuts on OJ's hands. There's a timeline consistent with the murders. History of escalating domestic violence. And as a person who, excuse me, has represented domestic violence victims, I can tell you that death to them is a real possibility, given the fact that, because the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when she decides to leave her batterer. And then they no longer have control over her. And they have the attitude, a lot of them, that if I can't have her, no one else can. And I've actually lost someone to a crime like that. So it's really not out of the realm of possibility. And taken together, absent misconduct, this is compelling evidence. So Mark Fuhrman literally took the case and it became a spotlight on him. So saying the evidence points to guilt is not the same as saying the trial was fair. Both can be true. Let's talk about the Bronco chase, where his friend A.C. Collins was driving him and he said that he was thinking about taking his own life. The slow speed chase was not evidence at trial, but it shaped public perception. You think if someone did not do anything wrong, why would they be running? Why would they be wanting to harm themselves? OJ fled rather than surrender. He carried cash, a disguise, a passport, and a firearm. Legally, flight can suggest consciousness of guilt, absolutely, and that could have been used, though it is not dispositive. Emotionally, it hardened belief long before jurors deliberated. And let's talk about something that if you are sitting on a jury, they will not talk to you about, but it happens a lot. And this is called jury nullification. And this is extremely uncomfortable for defense attorneys, extremely comfortable for prosecutors especially, because many legal scholars believe jury nullification played a role, and I think it did. And what jury nullification is when the jury decides to not listen to the evidence and they come back with a verdict that is not supported by the evidence. But the thing that I think a lot about is the fact that there were some flubs in the investigation when they put the sheet over the victims. I mean, that caused some fiber issues. There was an issue where the DNA expert was kind of mixing stuff, mixing different samples and it was really difficult apparently to get heads or tails there. But where they believe a defendant is guilty, but they acquit anyway to protest systemic justice. And if you watch the verdict of that case, and I'm sure you can see it on YouTube or whatever, but if you watch the verdict of that case, you will see that they literally were trying to send a message to Mark Fuhrman, to the LAPD, to LA. We're done. Like, this is what we've reached. This is our verdict. And this does not mean that the jurors were dishonest. It means that they were almost wanting to protest, to make a statement, which in my mind, when you have two people who were murdered, it's really not the time to make a statement. There are other ways to make a statement. It means they may have believed the system has harmed us too often to deserve our trust now. That is not a legal outcome. It is a moral one. And let's talk about other suspects and theories and why they failed. Alternative theories included drug dealers, organized crime, random intruders. No alternative suspect matched the full evidentiary profile. And you think about the brutality of the murders, clearly it was someone who was close to her. No comparable motive, no comparable opportunity, no comparable physical evidence. Reasonable doubt existed because of process failure, not because another suspect fit it better. And ultimately, I can tell you when the trial shifted. The trial shifted, let's tell you about a law school lesson that I learned, and I learned probably first couple weeks of law school. You never, ever, 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 ever hand the opposing side evidence when you are trying to prove something doesn't work. For instance, they were trying to prove that the glove would fit him. Well, obviously, OJ is not stupid, and he knows what he did and how it worked and all that. But you do not hand that to him to allow him to manipulate your evidence, because that is then in his control. Is he going to say, oh yeah, these fit great. Oh, I love these gloves, by the way. They were just great. Absolutely not. Because he knows if they fit him, then they probably belong to him, and the jury's going to figure that out. OJ Simpson was not a dumb guy. So, next we talk about the civil liability case. This is where the standard changed, and it means a lower burden of proof, because in criminal jury trials, it is beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil, it's a lower burden of proof, more likely than not. You can use the same core evidence, and there's no requirement of beyond reasonable doubt. It's a lower bar, which is easier to prove. OJ Simpson was found liable for the deaths. This verdict aligns with what many believe happened, while acknowledging criminal trial deficiencies. And then let's talk about the Vegas conviction and why it matters. In 2007, OJ Simpson was convicted in Las Vegas for armed robbery and kidnapping. And if you listen to that tape, you'll hear the real OJ Simpson and how quickly he can anger and how scary he can be. And if you almost go back and think about Nicole Brown Simpson and why she was scared. And she had every reason to be scared. And it's unfortunate that her life was taken without getting the protection that she needed and deserved, and to be able to raise her children. The key contrast is it was clean evidence, clear witnesses, no racialized police misconduct, no forensic confusion, conviction, and a lengthy prison sentence. The other thing, too, that I will say about that is the fact that people didn't understand DNA. And I remember my science teacher, I believe it was my junior year of high school, maybe senior year, and he said that there was a 1 in 10 billion chance that the DNA was not OJ Simpson's. At that time, I think we had 6 billion people in the world. So clearly, it was OJ Simpson's DNA. When the system works cleanly, outcomes are rarely debated. And why this case still matters. This case teaches us racism can distort justice even when guilt exists. It tells us bad actors can undermine strong cases. Public certainty is not legal certainty. Process failures harm everyone, including victims. Justice is not about choosing a side. It's about protecting standards even when the defendant is deeply unsympathetic. Here's your call to action. Listen with intellectual honesty. Hold multiple truths at once. And remember that justice systems fail not only when they convict the innocent, but when they cannot prove the guilty committed the crime. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope that you'll come back and see us again soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.